They vowed, "Till death do us part," but death came too soon. In the summer of 1985, love and murder walked hand in hand through the quiet streets of Detroit, Michigan. What began as a fairy tale romance between two young dreamers would end in a nightmare that shocked a community and challenged everything we thought we knew about love, loyalty, and the lengths people will go to for money. This is the story of Charles and Geraldine Hughes, a couple whose marriage certificate doubled as a death warrant, and whose vows of devotion masked a conspiracy so cold-blooded it would make even the most hardened detectives question the very nature of love itself. Thank you to all our loyal viewers and subscribers. Your support means everything. We're here every day with gripping true crime stories, deep dives, and the chilling details you won't hear anywhere else. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss an update. Because here at True Crime Vault, we don't just tell stories, we uncover the truth. Detroit, 1982. The city was struggling, but hope still flickered in the hearts of young lovers. Charles Hughes, 28, stood 6 feet tall with kind eyes and a smile that could light up any room. He worked double shifts at the Ford Rouge plant, his calloused hands a testament to honest labor and big dreams. Geraldine Williams, 24, was everything Charles thought he wanted in a woman. Beautiful, intelligent, with a laugh that made him forget about the long hours and the ache in his back. She worked as a secretary at a downtown law firm, always impeccably dressed, always composed. To everyone who knew them, they seemed destined for each other. Their wedding day, June 15th, 1983, was picture perfect. Geraldine wore her grandmother's pearls and a dress she'd saved 6 months to buy. Charles wore his father's old suit, tailored to fit his broader frame. The photos show two people glowing with happiness, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely believed they were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful life together. But photographs lie. What the camera couldn't capture was the conversation that had taken place just 3 weeks before the wedding. In the cramped kitchen of Charles's apartment, over cold coffee and unpaid bills, a different kind of vow was made. "We're never going to get ahead this way," Geraldine had said, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the Formica table. "Working ourselves to death for pennies while rich people get richer." Charles nodded, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "I know, baby, but what choice do we have?" Geraldine smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile their friends knew. This smile was calculated, predatory. "There are always choices, Charles. We just have to be smart about them." The plan began that night, born from desperation and nurtured by greed. They would need life insurance policies, substantial ones. They would need to establish themselves as a loving, stable couple. And eventually, they would need someone to die. The question wasn't whether they would kill. The question was who would be first. For the first year of their marriage, Charles and Geraldine Hughes played their parts to perfection. They were the couple everyone envied, hardworking, devoted, always talking about their future together. Charles picked up overtime whenever he could. Geraldine got promoted to senior secretary. They saved every penny, or so it seemed. What their neighbors didn't know was that every dollar they saved was being strategically invested in death. In September 1983, just 3 months after their wedding, they purchased their first life insurance policy. Charles convinced his supervisor at Ford to recommend a good agent, playing the part of the responsible husband perfectly. "My daddy always said a man who doesn't provide for his wife isn't much of a man," Charles told the insurance agent, his arm wrapped protectively around Geraldine's shoulders. "If something happens to me, I want to make sure my baby is taken care of." The agent, impressed by Charles's maturity and obvious devotion, helped them secure a $150,000 policy on Charles's life, with Geraldine as the sole beneficiary. But they weren't done. Over the next 18 months, Hughes acquired 4 more policies from different companies, a strategy Geraldine had learned about during her time at the law firm. Small policies here and there, nothing that would raise red flags individually. By early 1985, Charles Hughes was insured for just over $400,000, a fortune for a factory worker in 1980s Detroit. But Charles wasn't their only investment. Through Geraldine's connections at the law firm, they met Marcus Thompson, a 31-year-old struggling artist who lived alone in a studio apartment downtown. Marcus was everything Charles wasn't: sensitive, artistic, chronically broke. He painted beautiful landscapes that no one bought and wrote poetry that no one read. He was also desperately lonely. Geraldine befriended Marcus slowly, carefully. She would stop by his apartment after work, bringing groceries she claimed were extras from their shopping. She listened to his poetry, admired his paintings, and gradually became the closest thing to family Marcus had in Detroit. "You're like the sister I never had," Marcus told her one evening, as they sat in his cluttered studio, surrounded by canvases. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Geraldine smiled and squeezed his hand. "You'll never have to find out," she promised. That same week, she convinced Marcus to let Charles help him apply for life insurance. "It's just responsible," Charles explained, his voice full of brotherly concern. "What if something happens to you? Who's going to take care of your final expenses? Your art." Marcus, touched by their generosity and too trusting to see the trap being laid, agreed. The policy was modest, just $75,000, but it would be enough. Geraldine and Charles were listed as beneficiaries to cover funeral costs and preserve his artistic legacy. By March 1985, all the pieces were in place. The policies were active, the premiums were current, and Marcus Thompson trusted them completely. Now came the hardest part, deciding who would die first. April 23rd, 1985. A Tuesday that started like any other, but would end in tragedy. Charles Hughes called in sick to work that morning, something he rarely did. His supervisor noted it, because Charles was known for his perfect attendance. Meanwhile, Geraldine took a personal day from the law firm, telling her boss she needed to help a sick friend. That friend was Marcus Thompson, and by evening, he would be dead. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus had been complaining about headaches for weeks. Stress, he thought, from an upcoming art show that might finally give him his break. Geraldine had been so supportive, bringing him homemade soup and over-the-counter pain relievers. What Marcus didn't know was that those pain relievers had been carefully tampered with. Geraldine had spent months researching different methods. The law firm's medical library gave her access to toxicology reports and case studies. She learned about substances that could mimic natural causes: heart failure, stroke, respiratory distress. She settled on a combination that would be nearly undetectable in a routine autopsy. The morning of April 23rd, she brought Marcus his usual care package: soup, crackers, and what she called extra-strength headache medicine. "These are what my doctor prescribed when I was getting those terrible migraines," she told him, her voice full of concern. "They work so much better than regular aspirin." Marcus took them gratefully. He trusted Geraldine completely. She had been his guardian angel for months, the only person who seemed to care about his dreams and struggles. Charles arrived at Marcus's apartment around 2 p.m., ostensibly to help move some canvases for the upcoming show. By then, Marcus was already feeling dizzy and nauseous, but he attributed it to stress and lack of sleep. "You don't look good, man," Charles said, genuine concern in his voice. The ability to compartmentalize, to feel real affection for someone while planning their death, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Hughes' personality. Marcus laughed weakly. "Just nervous about the show, I think. Jerry brought me some medicine earlier, but I still feel awful." Charles suggested Marcus lie down while he finished organizing the art pieces. "Get some rest. I'll take care of everything." And he did. By 4 p.m., Marcus was unconscious. By 6 p.m., he was dead. Charles waited exactly 37 minutes before calling 911. Long enough to ensure there was no chance of revival, but not so long as to seem suspicious. His performance on that call was Academy Award worthy. The panicked friend, the desperate attempts at CPR, the raw emotion of someone losing a brother. "Please, you have to help him." Charles sobbed into the phone. "I came to check on him and found him on the floor. He's not breathing. Oh God, please hurry." The paramedics arrived to find Charles performing chest compressions on Marcus's lifeless body, tears streaming down his face. Geraldine arrived shortly after, having been called immediately by her distraught husband. The scene was heartbreaking. Two people devastated by the sudden loss of their dear friend. Geraldine collapsed beside Marcus's body, her sobs echoing through the small apartment. Charles had to physically support her as she whispered, "No, no, no, not Marcus. Not our Marcus." The medical examiner, faced with an apparently healthy 31-year-old man who had simply collapsed, initially suspected a heart defect or aneurysm. The preliminary autopsy revealed some anomalies, elevated levels of certain substances in Marcus's system, but nothing definitively pointing to foul play. Marcus Thompson was buried on a gray April morning, with Charles and Geraldine Hughes serving as pallbearers and delivering tearful eulogies about their beloved friend. They paid for the funeral themselves, a gesture that impressed everyone present and deflected any potential suspicion. The insurance claim was filed 2 weeks later. "It's what Marcus would have wanted," Geraldine told the claims adjuster, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "He always said his art was his legacy, but he worried about the practical things. This money will help preserve his work and make sure he's remembered." $75,000 was deposited into their account 6 weeks later. It should have been enough. It should have been the end, but it wasn't. The money changed everything. For the first time in their lives, Charles and Geraldine Hughes had financial breathing room. They paid off debts, bought a reliable car, and moved to a better apartment. To their friends and family, it looked like they were finally getting ahead through hard work and careful saving. But easy money has a way of making honest money seem impossibly slow. "We could be set for life," Geraldine whispered one night in August, 6 months after Marcus's death. They were lying in bed in their new apartment, the life insurance money having afforded them luxuries they'd never imagined. Egyptian cotton sheets, a real oak dresser, hope for a future that didn't include punching time clocks. Charles knew exactly what she was suggesting. They'd both been thinking it, but neither had been brave enough to say it out loud. "The other policies," he said finally. "The other policies," she confirmed. Charles Hughes was insured for $400,000. Split between the multiple policies, it would look like prudent financial planning, not suspicious over-insurance. And Charles, devoted, hard-working Charles, would never be suspected of being involved in his own death. Except, of course, that he wouldn't actually die. The plan was more complex this time. Charles would need to disappear convincingly, leaving behind evidence of death without producing a body. They spent weeks researching missing persons cases, studying how people vanish and when they're presumed dead. Geraldine's legal background proved invaluable. She knew that death certificates could be issued without bodies under certain circumstances: drowning accidents where the body was never recovered, hiking accidents in remote areas, situations where death was presumed but not confirmed. They settled on a camping trip gone wrong. Charles had always been an outdoorsman, so a solo camping expedition wouldn't seem out of character. They chose Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore in northern Michigan. Beautiful, remote, and with enough dangerous areas along Lake Michigan to make an accidental death plausible. The preparation was meticulous. Charles practiced swimming in cold water to build up his tolerance. They studied the coastline, identifying spots where someone could theoretically fall and be swept away by currents, but also places where someone could hide and wait. Geraldine established an alibi by scheduling a girls' weekend with friends from work, a spa retreat that would put her 200 miles away when Charles disappeared. They even had practice runs. Charles would drive to remote areas, abandon his car with signs of struggle, then hike to predetermined meeting points where Geraldine would pick him up hours later. They timed everything, refined their story, and eliminated every possible flaw. But there was one thing they didn't account for. Marcus Thompson had a cousin. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been a cop for 12 years when she got the call about Marcus Thompson's death. She'd seen enough natural deaths to know when something felt wrong, and Marcus's case had been nagging at her for months. The cousin, Marcus's only living relative, had flown in from California for the funeral and asked pointed questions that made Mitchell take a second look at the file. Marcus was terrified of medicine, the cousin told her. "Had been since we were kids. He wouldn't even take aspirin unless he was literally dying. The idea that he'd take some random pills from a friend? That's not Marcus." Mitchell pulled the file and started digging. What she found made her blood run cold. The Hughes had been the last people to see Marcus alive. They'd been unusually involved in his financial affairs. And most disturbing of all, they'd suggested he get life insurance just months before his death. As Mitchell dove deeper into the investigation, Charles and Geraldine were putting the finishing touches on their own deadly plan. The camping trip was scheduled for September 15th, 1985. Charles Hughes had less than 3 weeks to live, or so everyone was supposed to believe. September 15th, 1985, dawned gray and cold. Perfect weather for a tragedy. Charles Hughes kissed his wife goodbye at 6 a.m., loading his camping gear into their Honda Civic with the practiced movements of an experienced outdoorsman. Neighbors saw him checking his equipment one final time, adjusting the straps on his backpack with the careful attention of someone who understood the dangers of the wilderness. "Be careful out there," Geraldine called from the doorway, her voice carrying just the right note of loving concern. "Call me when you get to the campsite." Charles smiled and waved. "I will, baby. Love you." It would be the last time anyone would see Charles Hughes alive. Or so the plan went. At 7:15 a.m., Charles's Honda was spotted by a park ranger entering Sleeping Bear Dunes. The timestamp would later become crucial evidence, proving Charles had indeed arrived at the park as planned. What happened next was supposed to be a masterpiece of deception. Charles hiked to a predetermined spot along the bluffs overlooking Lake Michigan, a scenic but treacherous area where the sandy cliffs dropped nearly 200 feet to the churning water below. He set up his campsite meticulously, establishing a clear timeline of normal camping activities. At 2 p.m., he made the first of two crucial phone calls to Geraldine. "Hey, babe." His voice crackled through the static of poor cell reception. "Made it safely. The view up here is incredible. I can see why they call it Sleeping Bear. The dunes really do look like a giant bear lying down." Geraldine's friends later testified that she seemed genuinely happy during this call, relieved that her husband had arrived safely at what she described as one of his favorite places in the world. But Charles wasn't calling from the campsite. He was calling from a payphone 30 miles away, having already enacted the first phase of their plan. At the campsite, Charles had carefully staged evidence of a tragic accident. His hiking boots were placed at the edge of the bluff, positioned to suggest someone had slipped on the loose sand. His backpack was overturned nearby, contents scattered as if dropped in a panic. Most convincingly, there were clear drag marks in the sand leading right to the cliff's edge, marks Charles had created by dragging a heavy log wrapped in his spare clothes. The second phone call came at 6:30 p.m. "Jerry." Charles's voice sounded panicked, breathless. "Something's wrong. I was hiking near the edge and the sand gave way. I barely caught myself, but I dropped my pack and, God, I think I'm hurt. My ankle." The line went silent for several long seconds. "Charles, Charles." Geraldine's voice was pure terror, an Oscar-worthy performance for the benefit of her friends, who could hear every word from the spa's common room. When the call ended abruptly, Geraldine collapsed in apparent hysterics. "Something happened to Charles," she sobbed. "He was calling for help, and then nothing." Her friends immediately began calling park services, demanding search and rescue teams, comforting their distraught friend, who was clearly imagining the worst. But 150 miles away, Charles Hughes was very much alive, hiking through the darkness toward a prearranged meeting spot where his widowed wife would pick him up in a stolen car they'd prepared weeks earlier. The plan was working perfectly. By morning, Charles would be presumed dead, swept away by the unforgiving waters of Lake Michigan. Geraldine would be a grieving widow with a solid alibi and $400,000 in life insurance money. They would be rich, free, and untouchable. Or so they thought. What they didn't know was that Detective Sarah Mitchell had been watching them for weeks. Detective Sarah Mitchell had seen enough staged accidents to recognize one, even from a distance. Her investigation into Marcus Thompson's death had led her down a rabbit hole that kept getting deeper. The Hughes weren't just unlucky, they were predators, and Mitchell was determined to stop them before they claimed another victim. When Charles Hughes was reported missing on September 16th, Mitchell was already suspicious. She'd been conducting surveillance on the couple for 3 weeks, documenting their movements, their phone calls, their increasingly expensive purchases despite their modest incomes. The timing was too convenient. The circumstances are too perfect. Mitchell drove to Sleeping Bear Dunes herself, arriving at the campsite before the official search and rescue teams had finished processing the scene. What she found there confirmed her worst fears. The staged evidence was good, very good, but not perfect. The drag marks in the sand told a story, but not the story Charles and Geraldine wanted them to tell. Mitchell's trained eye caught inconsistencies that the park rangers missed. The hiking boots were positioned wrong, placed too carefully without the random scatter that would result from someone actually slipping and falling. The backpack's contents were spread too evenly, as if deliberately arranged rather than spilled in panic. Most tellingly, There was no blood. If Charles had truly injured his ankle badly enough to cause panic, there should have been blood on the rocks, on his gear, somewhere. But despite a thorough search, investigators found nothing. Mitchell's suspicions were confirmed when she traced the phone calls. The second call, the panicked one about falling, had indeed come from the park area. But the cell tower data showed it originated from a location nearly 2 miles from the campsite, along a service road that would have taken Charles at least 40 minutes to reach on foot. Why would an injured man hike 2 miles away from his campsite to call for help? The answer was simple. He wouldn't. But an alive man executing a plan to fake his own death might drive to that location, specifically because it was far enough from the campsite to avoid immediate discovery while still being within the park boundaries. Mitchell began building her case methodically, piece by piece. She discovered that Geraldine had researched accidental death insurance payouts on her work computer just 2 weeks before Charles's disappearance. She found evidence that Charles had been practicing wilderness survival techniques, not the kind you'd need for a weekend camping trip, but the kind you'd need to survive alone in the woods for an extended period. Most damning of all, she discovered the stolen car. 3 weeks before Charles's death, a 1979 Pontiac had been reported stolen from a long-term parking garage at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The theft had seemed routine. Car thieves often targeted airport parking because cars could sit unnoticed for days. But Mitchell's investigation revealed that the car had been seen in the Sleeping Bear Dunes area on September 15th, just hours after Charles was supposed to have died. The net was closing, but Mitchell needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed to catch them in the act. So she waited. Meanwhile, Charles Hughes was living a nightmare he hadn't anticipated, hiding in a remote cabin 60 miles from the park, waiting for the search to be called off so he could return from the dead. He discovered that being legally dead was more complicated than they'd planned. He couldn't go anywhere in public. He couldn't contact anyone he knew. He couldn't even listen to the radio for fear of hearing about the search efforts and feeling guilt over the resources being wasted looking for him. For the first time since they'd started planning, Charles began to question what they were doing. But back in Detroit, Geraldine was already filing the insurance claims. She played the grieving widow perfectly. Too perfectly. She knew exactly what paperwork to file, exactly what legal language to use, exactly how long to wait before each claim to avoid raising suspicions. What she didn't know was that Detective Mitchell had contacted every insurance company, flagging Charles Hughes as a potential fraud case and requesting notification of any claims. When the first claim hit Mitchell's desk on September 30th, exactly 2 weeks after Charles's disappearance, the detective smiled grimly. "Got you," she whispered. But Mitchell's celebration was premature. She had suspicions, she had circumstantial evidence, but she still didn't have proof of murder. And more importantly, she didn't have Charles Hughes. As far as the law was concerned, Charles was a missing person, presumed dead. Without a body and without concrete evidence of foul play, Mitchell couldn't make arrests. She needed to force their hand. So she did something risky, something that could have destroyed her case entirely. She decided to let them think they'd won. October 1985. The search for Charles Hughes was officially called off after 3 weeks of fruitless efforts. The Coast Guard had combed Lake Michigan, volunteers had scoured miles of shoreline, and divers had explored every underwater cave and crevice in the area. No body was found, but that wasn't unusual for Lake Michigan. The big lake had claimed hundreds of victims over the years, many of whom were never recovered. Charles Hughes was officially classified as missing, presumed dead. Geraldine Hughes was officially a widow. Detective Mitchell watched from the shadows as Geraldine began the delicate process of claiming her husband's life insurance. The grieving widow was patient, professional, and surprisingly knowledgeable about the claims process, too knowledgeable for someone experiencing her first encounter with life insurance bureaucracy. But Mitchell was patient too. She had positioned undercover officers throughout Geraldine's world, a new neighbor in her apartment building, a fellow patron at her favorite coffee shop, even a janitor at the law firm where she worked. Every conversation was monitored, every movement tracked. Mitchell was fishing, waiting for Geraldine to make contact with her dead husband. She didn't have to wait long. On October 15th, 3 weeks after Charles's disappearance, Geraldine drove to a 24-hour diner 40 miles outside Detroit. Security cameras captured her sitting alone in a corner booth, apparently reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. But the undercover officer at a nearby table saw something else. Geraldine was writing on napkins and leaving them under a coffee cup when she went to the restroom. Each napkin disappeared when she returned, as if someone had taken them while she was gone. The officer couldn't get close enough to see what was written, but the behavior was clearly covert communication. Mitchell ramped up surveillance. For the next 2 weeks, Geraldine made similar trips to different locations. A rest stop on I-75, a 24-hour laundromat, and an all-night gas station. Always alone, always leaving something behind, always returning to find it gone. She was feeding information Charles, but Mitchell still couldn't prove it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Marcus Thompson's art. In late October, while processing Marcus's personal effects for his estate, investigators discovered something that had been overlooked during the initial search of his apartment. Hidden behind one of his canvases was a journal, a detailed record of his interactions with Charles and Geraldine Hughes over the months leading up to his death. Marcus, it turned out, had been a careful observer of human nature. His journal contained troubling observations about his friends. Entry dated March 10th, 1985. C and G came by again tonight. Strange conversation about insurance. G keeps asking about my policies, whether I have any, whether I think they're important. Feels odd. Why would she care so much about my financial planning? And C seemed nervous, kept changing the subject when I asked direct questions. Entry dated April 15th, 8 days before his death. Feeling sick again. G brought more of those pills. They help with the headaches, but make me feel dizzy and weird. Starting to wonder if I should see a real doctor. Something feels off, but I can't put my finger on what. The final entry, dated April 22nd, 1 day before Marcus died, called G to thank her for all her help. She seemed strange on the phone, distant, asked weird questions about my schedule tomorrow, whether anyone else was planning to visit. When I told her I was planning to stay in and rest, she seemed relieved, happy. Can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. The journal was a bombshell. It provided clear evidence that Geraldine had been monitoring Marcus's schedule and providing him with medication that made him sick. Combined with the insurance angle, it painted a picture of premeditated murder. But Mitchell still needed to find Charles Hughes. Her chance came on November 3rd, when one of her surveillance teams spotted something unusual. Geraldine had driven to yet another late-night rendezvous, this time at a truck stop near the Michigan-Ohio border. But instead of her usual routine of leaving messages and departing, she waited. At 2:17 a.m., a figure emerged from the woods behind the truck stop and approached Geraldine's car. The surveillance photos were grainy, taken from a distance with night vision equipment, but they were clear enough to identify the supposedly dead Charles Hughes. Mitchell's team watched as Charles and Geraldine embraced, a tender moment between two people who thought they'd outsmarted the entire world. They talked for nearly an hour, Charles occasionally gesturing animatedly, as if telling stories or sharing experiences from his weeks in hiding. Then Charles disappeared back into the woods, and Geraldine drove home. Mitchell had them, but she waited. She wanted more than just fraud charges. She wanted them both for murder. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Charles himself, living in hiding, was taking its toll. He'd lost weight, grown paranoid, and was struggling with the isolation. Worse, he was beginning to feel genuine remorse about Marcus, a complication neither he nor Geraldine had anticipated. During their November 3rd meeting, Charles had broken down. "I can't stop thinking about Marcus," he confessed to Geraldine, unaware that directional microphones were capturing every word. "He trusted us. He called us family. And God, Jerry, we killed him." Geraldine's response was chilling in its coldness. "He was weak, Charles. He was never going to amount to anything. We gave his life meaning. His death is funding our future. That's more purpose than he ever had alive." It was confession, justification, and evidence of premeditation all in one devastating recording. Detective Mitchell made her move the next morning. November 4th, 1985, 6:22 a.m. Geraldine Hughes was drinking her morning coffee and reading the newspaper when a knock came. She opened the door expecting a neighbor or delivery person and found herself face-to-face with Detective Sarah Mitchell and 6 armed officers. "Geraldine Hughes, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Thompson and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud." The words hit Geraldine like a physical blow. For a moment, her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the calculating killer beneath. But she recovered quickly, her legal training kicking in. "I want a lawyer," she said calmly. "And I want to know what this is about." "Your husband isn't dead, Mrs. Hughes," Mitchell said, watching Geraldine's face for any reaction. "And we have recordings of you discussing Marcus Thompson's murder." This time, Geraldine couldn't hide her shock. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor in a splash of brown liquid and white ceramic. While Geraldine was being processed at Detroit Police Headquarters, a coordinated operation was underway to capture Charles. Using the surveillance data from his meeting with Geraldine, investigators had triangulated his approximate hiding location to a 10-square-mile area of dense forest. It took them 18 hours to find him. Charles Hughes was discovered in a ramshackle hunting cabin, 20 pounds thinner and sporting a full beard that dramatically altered his appearance. When the tactical team surrounded the cabin, Charles didn't run or resist. He simply sat on the front steps with his hands visible and waited. "Is Geraldine okay?" were his first words when Detective Mitchell approached. Even facing life in prison, his first concern was for his co-conspirator, a loyalty that would prove to be his downfall. The arrest made national news. The story had everything journalists loved: attractive criminals, an elaborate scheme, innocent victims, and a shocking betrayal of trust. But the media coverage only told part of the story. What didn't make the headlines was the devastating impact on the victims' families. Marcus Thompson's cousin flew back to Detroit when she learned about the arrests. She sat in Mitchell's office, staring at the photos and evidence, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "Marcus loved them," she said quietly. "He talked about them constantly. How kind they were. How they were the only people who understood his art. He trusted them completely." The insurance companies had already paid out on Marcus's policy. The Hughes had received $75,000 for murdering their friend, money they'd used to fund their attempt to fake Charles's death and claim another $400,000. For Mitchell, this case represented something darker than typical greed. This was betrayal at its most fundamental level, the murder of someone who loved and trusted his killers. But the investigation was far from over. As Charles and Geraldine sat in separate jail cells, refusing to speak to investigators, Mitchell began uncovering evidence that suggested Marcus Thompson might not have been their first victim. The arrest of Charles and Geraldine Hughes opened a Pandora's box that horrified even seasoned investigators. As Detective Mitchell dug deeper into the couple's background, a pattern emerged that suggested Marcus Thompson was not their first victim. He was simply their first successful one. In 1983, shortly after their wedding, an elderly man named Robert Hayes died suddenly in his apartment. Hayes was a lonely widower who had befriended the young couple when they lived in his building. He had no family, no close friends, and had recently made Geraldine and Charles the beneficiaries of his modest $25,000 life insurance policy. Hayes's death had been attributed to natural causes, a heart attack brought on by advanced diabetes. But Mitchell's investigation revealed disturbing parallels to Marcus Thompson's case. Hayes had complained of headaches and dizziness in the weeks before his death. Geraldine had been bringing him meals and medication. Most chillingly, Hayes had mentioned to other tenants that Geraldine had suggested he increase his life insurance coverage to protect his legacy. The $25,000 from Hayes's policy had funded Hughes's wedding and honeymoon. It had also given them a taste for murder. Mitchell exhumed Hayes's body and ordered a comprehensive toxicological examination. The results were devastating. Traces of the same compound found in Marcus Thompson's system, preserved in the bone tissue despite 2 years of decomposition. Robert Hayes had been murdered, but the revelations didn't stop there. A review of Hughes's financial records revealed something that made Mitchell's blood run cold. They had been corresponding with lonely, isolated individuals through personal ads in newspapers across the Midwest. Each correspondence followed the same pattern: gradual friendship, financial advice including life insurance recommendations, and eventually, suggestions for face-to-face meetings. 3 other suspicious deaths in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana were now being investigated as potential Hughes victims, all elderly or isolated individuals, all with recent life insurance policies listing Charles and Geraldine as beneficiaries or executors. all initially ruled as natural deaths. The Hughes weren't just murderers. They were serial killers who specialized in targeting society's most vulnerable members. As this evidence mounted, Charles Hughes finally broke. Sitting in his jail cell on November 20th, 1985, faced with evidence of multiple murders and the possibility of the electric chair, Charles Hughes requested a meeting with Detective Mitchell. What followed was a confession that would haunt everyone who heard it. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It started with just one person, and then it became easier. Jerry said we were helping them, putting them out of their misery, ending their loneliness." The confession lasted 14 hours over 3 days. Charles revealed details that only the killer could know, describing each victim's final moments with a mixture of remorse and detachment that chilled even experienced interrogators. Robert Hayes had died slowly, over the course of several days, as the poison gradually shut down his organs. He'd called Geraldine repeatedly during his final illness, begging for help, trusting her to care for him. She would hold his hand while he was dying, Charles revealed. Tell him everything is going to be okay. He died thinking she was trying to save him. Marcus Thompson had suffered a similar fate, but his younger, healthier body had fought the poison longer. He'd experienced seizures, hallucinations, and periods of lucidity where he tried to call for help. He knew something was wrong at the end, Charles admitted. He looked at me, and I could see in his eyes that he understood. But it was too late. The other victims, an elderly woman in Ohio, a disabled veteran in Indiana, a homeless man they'd befriended in downtown Detroit, each had died alone, trusting the young couple who had shown them kindness. But Charles's most damning revelation was yet to come. "Jerry's already planning the next one," he told Mitchell. "There's a woman at her work, an older lady, recently divorced. Jerry's been working on her for months." The woman was Patricia Williams, 58, a recently retired secretary at the law firm who had been struggling with depression following her divorce. Geraldine had befriended her, offering support and companionship during Patricia's darkest moments. Mitchell's team found Patricia's apartment under surveillance and discovered that Geraldine had already convinced her to update her life insurance policy, with Geraldine listed as executor and beneficiary. Patricia Williams was scheduled to have dinner with Geraldine Hughes on November 22nd. She would have been victim number 6. The trial of Charles and Geraldine Hughes began on March 15th, 1986, in a Detroit courtroom packed with media, law enforcement, and family members of the victims. It would become one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Michigan history. Prosecutor Rebecca Martinez had built an airtight case. She had Charles's confession, physical evidence linking the couple to multiple murders, financial records showing clear motive, and the chilling recordings of their November 3rd meeting where they discussed Marcus Thompson's death. But she also had something else, a surviving victim. Patricia Williams took the stand on the 3rd day of trial, her voice shaking as she described how Geraldine had systematically gained her trust following her divorce. "She was like an angel," Patricia testified. "When my husband left me after 30 years of marriage, I thought my life was over. I was alone, broke, and honestly thinking about ending it all. Then Geraldine came in my life." Patricia described how Geraldine had gradually inserted herself into every aspect of her life, helping with finances, providing emotional support, even suggesting they update their insurance policies for security. "She made me feel like I mattered again," Patricia continued, tears streaming down her face. "She listened to me, cared about me, made me feel like I had family. If the police hadn't arrested her when they did." She couldn't finish the sentence. The defense strategy was desperate and predictable. Charles's attorney argued that his client was a simple man manipulated by a sophisticated woman who had used his love against him. Geraldine's lawyer claimed she was innocent, that Charles had acted alone and was now trying to frame his wife to reduce his own sentence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Handwriting analysis proved that both Charles and Geraldine had forged documents related to their victims' insurance policies. Phone records showed calls between them on dates when Charles was supposedly dead. Most damning of all, toxicology experts testified that the poison used to kill Marcus Thompson and Robert Hayes required specific knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology, knowledge Geraldine had gained through her access to medical texts of the law firm. Charles testified against his wife, a decision that destroyed any remaining illusion of their love story. "I loved her," he said from the witness stand, not looking at Geraldine as he spoke. "I would have done anything for her. But she never loved me. She just needed someone stupid enough to help her kill." Geraldine's reaction was captured by courtroom artists and photographers. She showed no emotion as her husband detailed their crimes, no tears as he described how she had manipulated him into becoming a killer. She sat perfectly still, perfectly composed, as if she were listening to someone else's story. The only time she showed any reaction was when the prosecutor played the recording of their November 3rd meeting, specifically the moment where she called Marcus Thompson weak and claimed his death had given his life meaning. For just a moment, viewers saw her smile. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, Charles Hughes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Geraldine Hughes received the death penalty, one of only a handful of women on Michigan's death row. During sentencing, Judge Harold Morrison delivered words that would be quoted in true crime documentaries for decades to come. "In 30 years on this bench, I have never encountered such calculated evil disguised as love. You preyed upon the lonely, the vulnerable, the trusting. You turned human kindness into a weapon and basic decency into a death sentence. The court can only hope that your punishment serves as a warning to others who might mistake other people's lives for their personal profit." But the story of Charles and Geraldine Hughes wasn't over. The convictions brought justice, but not closure. Patricia Williams, the woman who nearly became their 6th victim, struggled with survivor's guilt and trust issues that would plague her for years. She underwent extensive therapy and eventually moved to another state, unable to bear living in the city where she'd come so close to death. "I still have nightmares," she revealed in a 1990 interview. "Not about dying, but about how completely I trusted her, how easily she made me believe she cared about me." It makes you question everything. Every friendship, every kindness. How do you trust anyone after something like that? Marcus Thompson's cousin established an art foundation in his memory, using the recovered insurance money to support struggling artists, the kind of legacy Marcus would have wanted. But she admitted that every time she looked at one of his paintings, she thought about how he died believing his killers were his best friends. Detective Sarah Mitchell was promoted to lieutenant and specialized in insurance fraud cases for the remainder of her career. She kept Marcus Thompson's journal in her desk drawer as a reminder of why her work mattered. People think murder is about passion, about moments of rage or desperation, Mitchell reflected years later. But the Hughes case taught me that some of the most dangerous killers are the ones who murder with spreadsheets and actuarial tables. They don't see victims, they see profit margins. Charles Hughes spent his first years in prison writing letters to victims' families, begging for forgiveness that never came. He found religion, earned his GED, and became a model prisoner. But he never stopped loving Geraldine, a fact that disturbed psychologists who studied the case. Geraldine Hughes never showed remorse. During her years on death row, she maintained her innocence and spent her time studying law, filing appeal after appeal with the cold precision that had once made her an effective killer. She gave only one interview, in 1989, where she displayed the same chilling lack of empathy that had characterized her crimes. "People want to make this about good and evil," she said, her voice steady and calm. "But it's really about opportunity and weakness. We identified opportunities and exploited weaknesses. That's not evil, that's intelligent." When asked about the victims, her response was even more disturbing. "Everyone dies eventually. We simply monetize the inevitable." Geraldine Hughes was executed by lethal injection on April 15, 1992, exactly 7 years after Marcus Thompson's murder. Charles Hughes attended the execution, the first and only time he'd seen his wife since their sentencing. Witnesses reported that Geraldine's final words were directed to Charles. "I love you too, baby." Charles collapsed and had to be carried from the execution chamber. The Hughes case changed how insurance companies evaluate claims and how law enforcement investigates natural deaths involving recent policy changes. It also became a case study in criminal psychology programs across the country. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a forensic psychologist who evaluated both Charles and Geraldine, described their partnership as one of the most dangerous combinations possible in criminal behavior. Charles provided the emotional manipulation. He was genuinely likable, trustworthy, the kind of person people instinctively want to help. Geraldine provided the intellectual framework. She understood systems, loopholes, how to exploit bureaucracy and human nature. Together, they were almost unstoppable. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of isolated individuals in urban environments. Each of Hughes's victims had been alone, elderly, divorced, estranged from family, or simply struggling to make connections in an increasingly disconnected world. They weaponized loneliness, Detective Mitchell observed. They understood that desperate people make vulnerable targets, and they perfected the art of becoming exactly what those people needed most, right up until the moment they killed them. The Hughes had been planning to expand their operation. Police found detailed files on dozens of potential victims, lonely hearts and responders, recent widows and widowers, isolated elderly individuals they'd identified through various social services. Each file contained personal information, financial data, and what Geraldine called vulnerability assessments, cold, clinical evaluations of each person's emotional state and susceptibility to manipulation. If they hadn't been caught, investigators estimated the Hughes could have killed dozens more people over the following decade. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was how normal Charles and Geraldine seemed to everyone who knew them. Neighbors described them as the ideal couple, helpful, friendly, the kind of people you'd trust to water your plants or watch your children. Their wedding photographer, contacted during the investigation, remembered them as one of the happiest couples I'd ever worked with. They seemed so genuinely in love, he recalled. The way they looked at each other, the way they laughed together. If that was all an act, they were better actors than most people in Hollywood. This raised uncomfortable questions that the case never fully answered. Had their love been real? Was it possible to genuinely care for someone while conspiring to commit murder together? Or had their entire relationship been built on a foundation of shared darkness? Charles Hughes, now 67 years old, remains in prison at the Michigan Reformatory. He has never remarried, never had children, and rarely receives visitors. Prison psychologists describe him as a man consumed by regret, not just for his crimes, but for the love he still feels for the woman who led him into darkness. In his most recent psychological evaluation, conducted in 2020, Charles was asked if he would do anything differently if he could relive his life. His answer was as disturbing as it was revealing. I would have found a way to save Geraldine from herself. She was brilliant, beautiful, capable of anything. If I'd been stronger, if I'd been smarter, maybe I could have channeled that into something good instead of this. Even after decades in prison, even knowing what Geraldine had done, Charles Hughes still believed their love was real. Maybe that's the most frightening part of all. The marriage pact case continues to fascinate and horrify people nearly 40 years after the crimes were committed. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, and countless true crime podcasts. But for all the analysis and speculation, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Was Charles Hughes a willing partner in murder? Or was he a victim of psychological manipulation? The evidence suggests both could be true, that he was genuinely devoted to Geraldine while also being a calculating killer in his own right. Did Geraldine Hughes ever feel genuine love? Or was every emotion carefully calculated for maximum effect? Her consistent lack of remorse suggests a profound inability to form normal human connections, but her final words to Charles hint at something deeper. And perhaps most disturbing of all, how many other couples like the Hughes are out there, hiding behind facades of normalcy, while plotting against the innocent? The victims, Robert Hayes, Marcus Thompson, and the others, deserve to be remembered not as statistics or case studies, but as human beings whose trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. They opened their hearts to people they believed cared about them, and they died never knowing that their kindness had been their downfall. Detective Mitchell, now retired, still gets calls about similar cases, insurance fraud schemes, suspicious deaths involving recent policy changes, couples who seem too good to be true. The Hughes case taught law enforcement to look deeper, to question coincidences, and to remember that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look like us. Evil doesn't always announce itself, Mitchell said in a 2015 interview marking the 30th anniversary of the arrests. Sometimes it knocks on your door with a casserole and a smile. Sometimes it marries you and promises to love you forever. The Hughes case taught us that the most dangerous killers aren't the ones who hide in shadows. They're the ones who hide in plain sight. Charles and Geraldine Hughes made a vow on their wedding day. "Till death do us part." In the end, death did part them, but not in the way they promised before God and witnesses. Their marriage was built on murder, sustained by deception, and ended in betrayal. Yet even now, decades later, the question remains, was their love real, or was it just another weapon in their arsenal of destruction? The truth may be more terrifying than either possibility. That love and evil can coexist in the same heart, that devotion and murder can spring from the same source, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of destroying us. What do you think? Was the love between Charles and Geraldine Hughes genuine, or was their entire relationship just an elaborate cover for their killing spree? Could Charles have been saved from his dark path, or was he always destined to become a killer? Share your theories in the comments below. But be warned, this case will challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the nature of evil itself. If you found this story as fascinating and disturbing as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We dive deep into cases like this every week here at True Crime Vault, exploring the darkest corners of human nature and the thin line between love and murder. Check out our playlist of similar cases in the description below, and don't forget, the most dangerous predators are often the ones who look exactly like the people we trust most. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and remember, sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us. Was their love real, or just a cover? Tell us your theory in the comments. We read every single one.